Elizabeth dreamed of one day ascending to the throne, ruling not just England but the entire world. But there was one thing she didn't know. That shining crown was waiting not to grant her dreams, but to take away the most precious things in her life. London, 1934. On a foggy morning where thunder echoed through the palace as if shaking it. Raindrops tapping against the large windows didn't soak the people inside but dampened their hearts. Little Elizabeth sat silently by the window, holding her favorite teddy bear. She was 8 years old, but her eyes held a seriousness beyond her years. Maybe it was innate. Maybe the heavy surname she carried was a heavy cloak laid on her shoulders. She blinked as footsteps echoed against the palace walls. One of the servants bowed his head as he passed the door, but Elizabeth didn't even notice. She was lost in thought. Her childish mind tried to understand why everyone called her the future queen. "Why me?" she whispered to herself. "Why does everyone look at me and say, 'One day you will rule this country'?" At that moment, the door slightly opened and her father, King George VI, entered. A man bearing the weight of royalty on his shoulders, but carrying tired love in his eyes. He saw Elizabeth by the window and noticed she was thinking like a ruler, not like a mother. "What are you doing here, Lilibet?" he asked with a soft but firm voice. Elizabeth turned and looked at him. Without letting go of her bear, she quietly answered, "Just thinking, father." The king approached and sat beside his daughter. His gaze drifted beyond the window. The rain poured relentlessly. Then he lowered his head and looked at Elizabeth. "I know what you're thinking. Everyone tells you will sit on the throne one day, right?" Elizabeth nodded slowly. "Well, I'm curious about something, my little queen." "Do you know what the throne really means?" Elizabeth did not answer. The king took off his glasses and loosened his tie. Then he was silent for a moment and turned his gaze to his daughter's face. Now he would tell her the truth. "The throne is not just a chair, Lilibet. It is a lonely tower. A place where everyone applauds you but no one truly knows you. That throne is a burden where even your closest expect things from you. You will understand this better as you grow." Elizabeth blinked and bit her lip. She gripped her teddy bear tighter with her small hands. Then she asked a question, her voice barely audible. "Is mother happy?" The king was taken aback by this question. For a brief moment, his eyes drifted into emptiness. Then a bitter smile appeared on the corner of his lips. "Your mother fulfills her duties as a queen. Being happy is another matter." Elizabeth didn't fully understand these words, but in that moment she saw something in her father's eyes. Loneliness. Deep and indescribable loneliness. "And you?" she asked next. "Are you happy, father?" This time, the king didn't answer. He only stroked his daughter's head. Then he stood and drew the curtain. Outside, people passed by. Each of them lifted their heads and looked at the palace, secretly admiring those inside. But inside, they were just planning the future of a child. Later that day, Elizabeth went to her teacher, Miss Crawley's room to study history, politics, grammar. Despite her young age, she struggled with heavy subjects. Miss Crawley looked at Elizabeth behind her black glasses and said, "A ruler cannot govern the future without knowing the past, Your Majesty." Elizabeth wasn't used to the word Your Majesty. She was still a child. But every day, she grew a little more. At the end of the lesson, she was handed a Shakespeare book. She had to read the chapter, The Tragedies of Kings. When she got home, she left the book in her room and ran to her father. "Father, why do kings always die alone?" The king was surprised. The answer to that question might have been buried deep inside him. He took a deep breath. "Because, Lilibet, they have never fully trusted anyone throughout their lives." That sentence sank deep inside Elizabeth. Late at night, Elizabeth was alone in her room. Bare in her arms, eyes on the ceiling, she thought quietly. One day she would grow up, wear her mother's crown, and perhaps become the most powerful woman in the world. But this power, what would it take from her? Before closing her eyes, she murmured, "I wish I could just remain my father's little girl." But she was no longer just a girl. She was now the heir to a silent throne. London, Buckingham Palace, autumn 1932. As the dark veil of night covered the palace's vast corridors, silence was the greatest confidant of its inhabitants. The only sound echoing in the stillness was the slow heartbeat of little Elizabeth. She was only 6 years old, but her eyes held deep maturity. and her soul carried a heavy burden. The palace's immense splendor, the gilded walls, silk curtains, the sparkle of crystal chandeliers were no longer things to fill a child's imagination. For Elizabeth, this place was not just a home. It was a destiny, a duty, and most importantly, a sanctuary of loneliness. That day, cold winds blew outside. The leaves in the palace garden had begun to fall, and the scent of autumn lingered in the air. King George VI was walking with his daughter, his steps heavy. Elizabeth's small steps were steady and silent. Although the long hallway echoed with heavy footsteps, it seemed empty. But within that emptiness lay a great weight on both the king's and the little princess's shoulders. "Lilibet, look," said the king gently as he held his daughter's small hand. "You are not just a princess. One day, you will be the heart of this country. Everyone will be watching you." Elizabeth felt proud of her father's words but was also gnawed by growing questions inside her. Why does everyone focus so much on me? Am I not just a child? King George VI smiled but replied, "Sometimes the heaviest burdens are carried on the smallest shoulders, my dear." Outside the palace, a storm of crowds, chaos, admiration, and expectations was approaching, while inside, the storms were raging in this little girl's soul. A secret treasure, the first page of the diary. That night, the king took Elizabeth to her room. He opened an old, embroidered box and took out a small diary. The diary was leather-bound with the royal crest, old but elegant. As he handed the diary to Elizabeth, his eyes filled with tears. "This is your first decision that will shape your future, Lilibet. True power is the ability to think justly even when you remain silent." Elizabeth welcomed the diary. She looked for hidden sentences between the pages but was too young to understand. A spark was burning inside her. Perhaps that spark would one day turn into determination and courage. Silent walks in Windsor Castle. Weeks later, during a morning walk in Windsor Castle's garden, the king decided to share an important secret with his daughter. Walking among the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, a heavy silence surrounded them. "Lilibet," said King George VI, "the throne is not just about power, it can also be a punishment." Elizabeth looked up in surprise, seeing the seriousness on her father's face clearly for the first time. "A punishment? Why?" The king paused and took a deep breath. "Because one day, to earn everyone's love, you will have to hide your true feelings. Your smile will become just a facade, and worst of all, you will sacrifice even those you love most for that throne." These words cast a heavy shadow on Elizabeth's heart for the first time. Behind the throne, sparkle, loneliness, and loss began to make sense. Education and the shadow of loneliness. Day by day, Elizabeth's life changed. She no longer woke up cheerfully but with anxiety and unease. Every day, she was loaded with more knowledge and shaped by discipline. Latin lessons, politics, noble history, protocols. While a child wanted to play, she memorized rules. But every night, her father knocked on her door and told her stories from real life, not fairy tale stories of hard decisions and struggles. One day, when you stand before the President of France, your eyes must look forward, not down, he would say. And your heart must beat with the voice of the country. Elizabeth wrote these words in her diary, growing and maturing with every line. Moments with her mother. One evening, while brushing Elizabeth's hair, her mother whispered, "There's still time for you." Curious, Elizabeth asked, "What do you mean, mother?" Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "You can still live your childhood, play a little, have friends. Not everything is responsibility." Elizabeth nodded and said a heavy sentence. "I'm not just a child anymore. I am the future." At that moment, pride and sadness shone together in her mother's eyes, the king's farewell-like talk. One night, King George VI sat in his daughter's room holding an old crown. The crown dazzled with its brightness but reflected the silent weight of a past that bore its burden. "This crown was once mine, one day it will be yours. But you must not let it rule you. You must rule it." Elizabeth opened her eyes wide. "What if I fail?" The king stood up and touched her shoulder. "You are my bravest part, Lilibet. The world will see that. But remember, courage sometimes requires solitude." End of chapter. The last line in the diary. That night, Elizabeth wrote in her diary, "One day, I will be a queen in everyone's eyes. But in my father's eyes, I want to remain his little Lilibet." From that moment on, the silence echoing through the cold palace corridors carried a new meaning. The silent echo of a girl's growing heart.